everyone. So nice to have you all here. And I know that you're online somewhere. I know there's a camera somewhere. Welcome. Please rise in body or spirit with our opening hymn. Born in the South African freedom movement during the apartheid era, this Zulu and English song invites us to act in solidarity with all those who are oppressed. Its "we" identifies the struggle as our own. Join it. Marching in the light of God. We are marching, oh, we are marching in the light of God. We are marching, oh, we are marching in the light of God. Okay, that'll get us going, eh?
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm the Reverend Leslie Takahashi, and my pronouns are she and her. We're so grateful to have you here today on this beautiful day. We're, of course, grateful for those rainy days, but sometimes on Sunday mornings, it's nice not to be wet. So we're glad you're here and that you've chosen to spend part of your week with us here in the sanctuary, in the Borton Hall, if you need more space, or on our live stream. And we have quite a few people on the stream today, so welcome to them. Welcome back. We've got a couple people who haven't been here for quite a while. We're glad you're here. And for those online, we hope you will join us for our virtual coffee hour to stay and say hello for about 15 minutes after the service ends. If you're visiting here on campus, we hope you'll sign a visitor's card so that you can do that either virtually or at the rainbow table after the service. If you are in need of a listening ear, Please know that our pastoral listeners are on campus. You can see them near the water column during the offertory, and that is the way you can identify them and you can connect with them after the service. Today is a Justice Sunday, so please stay and help us assemble kits for Jewish family services, or you can help make a sign for tomorrow's MLK Witness, which will be at the corner of Broadway and Civic in downtown Walnut Creek at 11 tomorrow morning. So this is also the time that it's really wonderful to commit and meet new people. Our signups for community circles continue today. Welcome to this beloved community.
Good morning. My name is Steve Deach. I'm a member of your Board of Trustees, and my pronouns are he and him. Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church is a welcoming faith community. We begin our services by reading our mission together. We bring to life our Unitarian Universalist values as we seek truth and work for justice, nurture compassion and courage, reach out to each other and to our larger community of faith, bridge the divisions that wound the human family, transform ourselves and our world. January is a great time to get involved. Check out the weekly email and Beacon newsletter for the many things that are going on in our community. We're very glad to have all of you with us. Our expectation is that those that are in the church are either fully vaccinated and boosted and don't have symptoms of any of the communicable things that are going around in the community right now. Thank you for honoring this commitment to each other. There is a congregational forum next Sunday to discuss some of the proposed bylaw changes and a congressional meeting on Sunday the 28th. Members, please watch your inboxes for a virtual forum that will be sent your way this week. And welcome. It's good to be together.
We are honoring the Martin Luther King Day weekend this weekend, even though it seems a little early. It just happens that the third Monday was connected to the second weekend, which is a little odd for us. But so in that spirit, we are grateful to have one another here as part of building a more just world. And let's just greet each other saying, I'm glad you're part of our movement today. So I am going to invite our children and youth and those young at heart to join me up here in the front. And Rowena, if you want to well, this will be right, this is just a couple minutes, so yeah. We're glad you're here. It's wonderful to see all of you. And I'm gonna talk with you about something. It's great to see you. Happy New Year. Some of you I didn't see in the new year. Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, everyone's wishing everyone a Happy New Year. So I'm going to talk with you about something that you might not think about a lot, but because we're talking about the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I'm going to talk about something that's called prayer. Does anyone know what a prayer is?
Yeah, it's like sometimes it's like when you really want something and you're like, oh no, please let this happen, right? But for Dr. King, who had to deal with a lot of really difficult things, a prayer was really important to him. And so he would call on something that's larger than himself when he wasn't sure what his resources were to make it through something. So sometimes when we feel like there's something that's so big, it's bigger than us, we ask for there to be help beyond ourselves, right? And sometimes, so has anyone ever asked for help with something? Yeah, I know I have, like 6 times today already, at least. Probably an underestimate, right? Yeah, maybe 7. So that's what a prayer is. It's like sometimes when we just ask, let me do the best that I can, but whatever I can't do, let somebody else help do it. And that's what a prayer does. And Dr. King also said that we need to be careful how we use prayers, even though he prayed every day. He said we should not use prayers to substitute for when we should act. We don't just want to pray and think about something. Sometimes it's time for us to do something. And so he said we have to think about that. So that's something we have to ponder as we go through. So when we need something, we should remember we can ask for something from those that are beyond ourselves. And that's our mindful moment for today. We're going to light our chalice.
I'm Rowena McGregor. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929. At the time of his birth, he had the name of Michael Luther King. He later changed it to Martin because he was following in the footsteps of his grandfather and his father, and they both had the name of Martin. Martin Luther King Day honors the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and set aside as a day of service to encourage all Americans to volunteer and to improve our communities. Dr. King was a Baptist minister and leader of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s. He was a smart young man, and he graduated from high school at age 15. He then enrolled in Morehouse College, which is a black college in Atlanta, Georgia, and to get his doctorate. There he met and married Coretta Scott. 2 sons and 2 daughters were born into his family. King was an advocate for nonviolent protests and civil disobedience. He led organized sit-ins, marches, and peaceful protests. He led the Montgomery bus boycott, and in 1963, the March on Washington. In 1964, he became the youngest winner of a Nobel Peace Prize. For that prize, he was given $54,123, and he turned it all over to the furtherance of civil rights movement. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, while standing on the balcony of a hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee, he was leading a protest march in sympathy with the striking garbage workers in Memphis. He was assassinated. President Ronald Reagan signed a bill in 1983 that added Martin Luther King Jr. Day to the list of federal holidays. This wasn't officially observed for him until 1986.
All right, I have a story for you all today about a woman named Grace Lee Boggs. And you can see our photos up on the screen. Have you ever noticed something that could be changed for the better? Have you ever wanted to make a difference in people's lives? Grace Lee Boggs did. That's why she became an activist. Grace was on her way home one day when she saw her neighbors marching in the street. They were protesting for better housing. Grace lived in a basement filled with rats, so the protest gave her hope. Seeing people fight for change affected her. She knew she had to join them. Grace was born in 1915 in Providence, Rhode Island, over her family's Chinese restaurant. Both of her parents were immigrants. Her mother had no schooling. She escaped a hard life in China as a girl, but she and Grace's father built a successful restaurant in New York City's Chinatown. Grace looked up to her parents. Their perseverance through hardship planted the seeds of her activism. Grace was smart from a young age. At 16, she went to Barnard College. Grace turned to philosophy because other classes didn't make sense when the world needed changing. She was inspired by the ideas of philosophers she read about. Grace would come to especially like philosophers like Karl Marx, Friedrich Hegel. Hegel said, because reality is always changing, ideas have to change too. At 25, she earned her PhD from Bryn Mawr College. After graduating, Grace had a hard time finding a job. No one would hire an Asian person to teach philosophy. Even department stores would not hire Asian people. She finally got a job at a library at the University of Chicago for very low pay. Grace had to find free housing. The living conditions in her building and neighborhood weren't good. Many of the homes were filled with rats. She didn't think anyone should have to live like that. She met Black activists in her neighborhood who felt the same way, and she wanted to get involved in their cause. Grace moved to Detroit. She worked for a newsletter where she could write about her ideas. There, she met James Boggs, known as Jimmy. He was an auto worker and had the same ideas about change. Grace and Jimmy got married. They became important activists in Detroit. They fought for many causes, including workers' rights, civil rights, women's rights, and the environment. They wrote books about their ideas. They even wrote one book together, Revolution and Evolution in the 20th Century. In 1992, they started Detroit Summer, a program for youth. The program helped young people get involved in their community. Grace and Jimmy's living room became a spot for activism in Detroit. Grace and Jimmy were also active in the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement protested things such as police violence, loss of jobs, and failing schools. Grace and Jimmy helped organize protests and conferences with important leaders such as Malcolm X, and one was a march down Woodward Avenue in Detroit in 1963, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke. Jimmy died when Grace was 78, but Grace didn't stop fighting for change. She loved talking with people everywhere and listening to them. Grace's favorite question to ask was, "What time is it on the clock of the world?" She believed people talking to each other is where the best ideas come from. Grace wanted everyone to become a solutionary, or someone who tries to find solutions to help solve problems. After so many years of movements and protests, Grace saw reality change, so Grace changed her ideas. Instead of trying to make big changes, Grace focused on smaller changes. She saw hope in Detroit's people, painting murals, planting community gardens and urban farms, and creating schools. She saw hope in small local groups doing grassroots actions. She didn't want people to follow leaders. She wanted everyone to be leaders themselves. Grace kept talking with people in her living room, making light bulbs go off in their heads. She sent people home with lots of books to read after they talked. She did this until the age of 100. In June of 2015, the Detroit community held a big 100th birthday party for Grace. They celebrated her life's work before she died that October. Today, programs such as Detroit Summer, the James and Grace Lee Boggs School, and the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership continue to honor Grace and Jimmy. They are still helping people become solutionaries to change the world. And then we have a quote from Grace Lee Boggs. "We are the leaders we are looking for." The end. And now I'd like to invite you to sing our children and youth to their activities.
Go in love, our hearts go with you. Go in joy, our hopes go too. Learn in love and grow in wisdom. Shine your light in all you do.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Patricia Craven, and I am your worship associate for this morning. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. Okay, so as I speak today, there may be some tears, but they're not tears of pain or hurt. They are actually just sometimes when I speak from my heart. This has probably been the most difficult week in trying to come up with the writing for today. It has been not easy to gather my thoughts and feelings about what it means to me to be a white ally. But yesterday I realized that part of why the difficulty was because the path of becoming a white ally and acting as a white ally is not easy or direct or straight. It has been and continues to be starts, stops, fighting, confusion, pain, and many, and I mean many, mistakes and need for amends. Growing up, my racial identity was very complex. My father internally held himself as a Native American and because of his mother, and he brought those teachings into my upbringing. However, societally, he appeared and acted as a white person. My mother died when I was young, and the woman my father married was Native American, and he eventually died on the reservation in Oklahoma. This made it even more confusing for me. I was very close to my father, and I identified a lot with that complex identity. And I walked in the world very much in many Native ways. As I became political in my early 20s, race became even more of an issue of exploration for me. I realized that I often did not feel white among people as I sat in groups. I began to identify as a person of color. Yet something inside of me said, something's not right here. I had spent over 30 years before I came to MDUC working for racial justice. I attended many workshops, and I actually taught quite a few workshops on race. But it was really during my second beloved conversations that I began to realize that though I had this racial identity, that the Native identity was something that was private to me. I realized that racial identity is just not what I think about myself or what I feel about myself, but that it actually was having to understand that there's a structure and systems in our culture that are based on race and what people look like and what the color of their skin. That in this structure, I was privileged and that I had a responsibility, that I do also hold other cultural identities that are oppressed, but that doesn't matter. That as a white person, I need to really own, again, the privilege and the responsibilities that I have as part of our community. Though this process was very painful for me to realize that, it has really brought a great deal of relief and helped me become clear and more honest in making change and working for racial justice. Lastly, I wish to share that being a white ally is not just about my behavior. It is about what I think deep inside, my beliefs, my values, and how that comes from my upbringing and the white conditioning that I was brought in. And like I said, this is not easy, and that the ways and values, it begins knowing where I sit in this system. And I would like to invite all of you, especially those who do identify as white, have been raised as white, to really ask yourself, where do you sit in that system? And what your identity means, and where you bring those thoughts and feelings so that you may join me in fighting for racial justice. Thank you.
And now, if you'd please rise in body or spirit and join me in singing number 119 in the Great Hymnal. James Russell Lowell was a literary critic, a poet, humorist, Harvard professor, and the first editor of the Atlantic Monthly. This text comes from his poem, The Present Crisis, protesting the war in Mexico. Once to every soul and every moment, side in the strife of truth with falsehood, for the good or evil aside, then to stand with truth is noble when we share its wretched crust. It cause bring fame and profit, and 'tis the prosperous to be just. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet 'tis truth alone is strong. Though its portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong, then it is the brave one chooses, while we coward stands aside, till the multitude make virtue of the faith they have denied.
This is the time in our service when we take into the larger embrace of this community those joys and sorrows that are too great to hold alone. And I invite those who have written in the book of Joys and Sorrows to come forward at this time. We have a couple that we're going to do before that as well. I'm asking Reverend Rodney to light a candle for Mary Schreibner, who writes that she is recovering well from her surgery and is looking forward to being with all of us again soon. I also am asking Reverend Rodney to light a candle for Isabel Johnson, who is our, we believe, oldest member of our congregation at 101. Isabel is in the hospital following some complications with her health, and is not up for taking calls, but if anyone wanted to drop a card off on campus, we will be taking them to her on a regular basis. So please consider a card for Isabel so she knows that we are thinking of her. And Maria Hunt is lighting a candle today. She writes prayers for our friend John, who passed away this week of cancer, and especially for his wife, Asija, and a 9-year-old twin boys. Thank you, Maria, holding them in our hearts. And I ask Reverend Rodney to light 2 final candles, which first holds our joys and sorrows that are not put into words, but which are part of our embrace here today as a community. And the second holds our hopes and dreams for this one imperfect but precious world of which we are a part.
Please stay seated and enjoy this musical meditation. The words of this song were composed by Thich Nhat Hanh as a poem and then set to music by his community at Plum Village, where his form of engaged Buddhism is practiced. My joy's like a spring so warm, it makes flowers bloom all over the earth. My pain's like a river of tears, so vast it fills the 4 oceans. Please call me by my true names, so I can hear all my cries and laughter at once, so I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so that I can wake up and the door of my heart could be left open.
Raised in both the Catholic and Baptist traditions, prayer was an essential aspect of my childhood. I remember watching my grandparents hit hard times in their lives, both emotionally and economically. Their refuge was their kitchen table, where you could find them in communal prayer. This simple act brought them comfort. They spent time in community with one another and invoked a connection to the divine spirit of life beyond their understanding. As a minister, I know prayer to be personally a powerful technique to focus my heart and spirit so that I might make meaning out of difficult situations. And as a science-minded person, I recognize the psychological studies that support the use of prayer as a ritual to accomplish so many things, including the following in our human bodies: reduction of anger and aggression, an increase to an openness for forgiveness, and aiding in our ability to sometimes see others' perspectives. In other studies of prayer, we see that people, when they believe in an all-loving divine presence versus a punishing, angry divine presence, their mental and physical health can improve. While we as a community value and hear about the wisdom of Martin Luther King Jr. throughout our year, tomorrow is our time to nationally recognize his life and contribution. As a minister, he knew we know his perspective on prayer. He wrote, quote, "No one can believe how powerful prayer is and what it can affect, except those who have learned it by experience. Whenever I have prayed earnestly, I have been heard and have obtained more than I prayed for. God sometimes delays, but he's always on time." Recognizing that our Unitarian Universalist faith is pluralistic and has varied understandings of God, prayer, and faith, I invite you all to enter with me into a ritual of my upbringing. I ask you to join me at my grandparents' proverbial table in the deep ask of prayer. Eternal and ever-loving Spirit of life, we gather before you today troubled by the weight of the world and the turmoil of war that surrounds us. We recognize that we are trapped in a situation where leaders of the world find it acceptable to sow division and discontent by using the old techniques of dehumanization and fear. We know that communities like ours can provide refuge against those poisonous concepts. We know that we can't fight these actions alone. We need one another. Our freedom and liberation is so tightly bound with all other people. Great mystery of the silence, our hearts are aching for the end to this violence and suffering for so many in our city, our county, our state, our country, and our world. May this prayer sear into our hearts the words of your prophet, Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke of a fierce urgency of now, urging us to rise above complacency and the comfort it brings, asking us instead to engage and work towards justice and peace, even in the smallest of ways. We pray for our world leaders, Mother God, and Great Shekinah, that you may grant them wisdom to navigate these troubled times, aid their recognition that all people are interconnected, place onto their hearts an insistence that walls that divide us must come down. May they heed the call of Rafiq Kassis from the Kyrios Palestine organization, who begs us not to differentiate between the people of Palestine and Israel in our prayers, but rather pray that we see no difference between them. Pray instead for humanity as a whole. These are the same sentiments we lift for the people of Congo, Sudan, Ukraine, and all other places of strife in this world. Grant us, O Divine, the courage to confront our own biases and prejudices. Help us reject the temptation to see enemies where there are none, and to nurture compassion and empathy in all of our hearts. May we hold fast to the belief that an actionable and embodied love will ultimately triumph over hatred and fear. O source of light, guide us towards a world where peace reigns supreme and the beloved community can become a reality. I ask that we hold the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who reminds us that everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love. May our love truly abound. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.
Me and all my friends, we're all misunderstood. They say we stand for nothing. There's no way we ever could. Now we see everything that's going wrong with the world and those who lead it. We just feel like we don't have the means to rise above and beat it. So we're waiting, waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting on the world to change. It's hard to beat the system So we keep waiting, waiting on the world to change. Now, if we had the power to bring our neighbors home from war, they would have never missed a Christmas. No more ribbons on the doors. But when you trust your television, what you get is what you got. 'Cause when they own the information, they can bend it all they want. That's why we're waiting, waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting on the world to change. It's not that we don't care, we just know that the fight ain't fair. So we keep waiting, waiting on the world to change. We're still waiting, waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting on the world to change. Hey, one day your generation is gonna rule the population. No pressure. We're waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting on the world to change. Keep on waiting, waiting on the world to change. Waiting on the world to change.
Good morning. I'm Sharon Solstice. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about something that happened to me here a few months back that I hope will be useful for some of you. So last summer, the young adults created and led one of our worship services. And in that service, we were blessed with 3 musical offerings by my daughter, who is Claire Solstice. And the musical offering, which as you know comes right before the call for the offering, was Claire de Lune, I believe. And she played beautifully. And I was moved. The music and my mother's pride. So as the music was ending and I came up here, I introduced myself and then I said, and I am the mother of the musician. And the reason I said that rather awkward sentence was because my eyes had tears, and I could tell my voice was about to crack, and I felt an explanation was in order. So y'all responded to that with a huge applause. And that gave me the moment I needed to compose myself and continue. So a few weeks after that, I was thinking back about that moment and wondering, why, when I have been to literally dozens of my daughter's piano recitals, and she has played beautifully at most of them, why did I never get teary-eyed there? And of course the answer is you and this sacred sanctuary. And I was thinking about my experience in this community and the numerous times I have been challenged to step outside of my comfort zone. And I've accepted those challenges, and sometimes I've failed, and sometimes I've succeeded, but regardless, I have always been held in love and support. And so my body, my psyche knows that when I'm feeling emotion in this sacred space, it's okay for it to show. And for those of you who have that kind of a relationship with this beloved community, I'm very happy for you, and my wish is that all of us have or will come to have that kind of a relationship. And with that, Those of you who are online, feel free to go find that Give Now button on the web page. And for those of us here, the ushers will now come forward. Please join me in reading the dedication of our offering. To the work of this community in transforming ourselves and our world, we dedicate ourselves and our offerings.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the first people I ever thought of as a leader. Not when he was leading, I was an infant. Yet later, I thought of him the way we were taught to think of leaders then, when I was a child, as a celebrated hero who had fixed the problem for all of us. Some of you know of what I speak. You might not admit it, but you know what I'm talking about. It was true in a way, and it was also not true in a way. And it's the ways that it was not true that I want to talk about today. Because we are trained to think of leaders as single actors, and on this particular MLK holiday weekend in 2024, we do this, I believe, at our own peril. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I need to say to you all, I came of age in the South, and I was schooled by a number of black people who were willing to offer me a little raising, and they told me that is how you always say it. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We celebrate his individual gifts and sacrifices, and also I believe that this holiday calls upon us to celebrate something much larger than any individual, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how skilled they are, no matter how talented they are, can hold, and that is the collective power of humanity. In 2024, it's easy to look at our world and wonder if we are, in fact, any better off than we were in King's Day, if we have, in fact, changed the course of life for the better, for so many, as Rodney said in his prayer today, are suffering and have been sacrificed. And yet we also know that at some level, our understanding of what we should be to one another has, in fact, widened, has, in fact, deepened. And, in fact, so much so that we see a huge push back against that widening, against that deepening that we're living with today. Neither of your two ministers who are up here today would have been leaders in King's time, probably, in this kind of a setting. And yet many among us would not be claiming their true names, as our meditation song called us to do. And still that goal of beloved community, that kingdom of heaven on earth which our universalist ancestors spoke of, seems sometimes like it's been pushed farther and farther and farther up against the horizon, rather than closer to us where we want it to live. That at the hands of those who would continue to divide us to keep their unnatural power. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a single actor. He was the leader of a mass movement of black people and their allies who had grown to be increasingly disillusioned with the world as they inhabited, and they wanted to make change in that world. The change they made was not inspired by any single person, but by a series of successive leaders and a series of successive changes, and it was the dialogue among all of those leaders that actually pushed things forward. It was the collective trust of generations of people of faith that included the works of Miles Horton, who was a white man who with others formed the Highlander Center, which trained Rosa Parks and others involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. Horton's work was based on that of Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian who is best known as the composer of the Serenity Prayer, which is used to liberate people from addiction. However, he was also committed to liberating people through reshaping society based on the teachings of Jesus. That was his larger mission. Now, Dr. King himself was shaped by these ideas and also by other legacies. King spoke of Mahatma Gandhi as his guiding light, the ripple that the Indian leaders started with the Great Salt March protesting the English colonial rule might have become the second incarnation of the March on Washington. Gandhi, in turn, had developed these ideas after coming across the Russian Count Leo Tolstoy's article, A Letter to a Hindu, which promoted a nonviolent strategy over the violent one that the Indian youth were seeking to use to free India. Tolstoy was, at that time, 87, and he had been sent a pamphlet by our Universalist ancestor, Aden Ballou, of whom Tolstoy predicted in the vernacular of his times, he will be, in the future, acknowledged as one of the chief benefactors of mankind. The pamphlet, which was called On Christian Non-Resistance, was published in Hopedale, the utopian community in Massachusetts, which Aden Ballou had begun to try to live into nonviolence, and which also shared an economic order that we might know as socialism today. So there were a lot of people out there, a lot of people pushing, a lot of people behind this legacy. And if we set aside the great man view of history, we can see that it is actually about a movement of change. A pebble drops and the ripples extend until they touch one another, and someone drops another pebble. King's pebble itself inspired countless other leaders, black, white, and of all races. One of those was Grace Lee Boggs, who we heard about in our Time for All Ages, a Chinese-American woman who put King's ideas in dialogue with those of another black leader, Malcolm X. King was also informed by Malcolm X and other contemporaries of his time, and they pushed him to consider things that otherwise he might not have. Grace Lee Boggs, whose organizing base was, in fact, the African-American community, had been involved in a planned march on Washington in the 1940s, which was canceled when President Roosevelt agreed to grant some rights to the black people who had been serving in the military, for that was the focus of that first march on Washington. Here, closer to home, if we look at those ripples going out, Betty Reed Soskin, who was a member of this community, who also led activism here in our East Bay area, is now being commemorated in a documentary which we hope to gather here to preview some of the film from here in the coming weeks. There were so many ripples and so many people who made a difference in individual lives. So that is something that matters, even in a world where racial injustice, economic injustice, and many other kinds of inequity still remain. So many people took the ideas of others, and that is really the way that a movement works. Today's activists don't talk so much about wanting to be the next great person of history even, but they think more in terms of collective liberation, the idea that we will not be free until all of us are free, an idea, by the way, that Dr. King helped popularize. To be part of a movement means that your pebble might ripple on, and you might not even know who gets touched by the widest circles of those waters. And also, your ripples may be interrupted and your course may be changed by the ripples from someone else. And that is part of being part of a movement as well, to be aware of the dialogue with others in leadership. Dr. King, throughout his life, and he would have been 97 this year, so it is not, as we consider those lives among us here, it is not out of the question that he could still be alive. Dr. King continued to learn and grow, and one of the people who was a partner in learning for him was the Vietnamese monk known as Thich Nhat Hanh, who wrote the poem that was our meditation song today, and he was one of the people whose ripples edged King towards joining the peace movement, the movement against the war in Vietnam. The war was greatly troubling to King personally, and yet he could have easily decided not to weigh in on that war because it was something that many who supported him asked him not to do. Many of his partners in the struggle for black liberation felt he should not comment on it because it would be a distraction from the civil rights struggle, and worse, could alienate people who were critical to the success of that work. And yet he said, in 1967, in a speech he entitled, "A Time to Break Silence," delivered almost exactly a year before he was assassinated, these words: And some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, for surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesizing of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us, he said. If it is, let it trace its movements and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness which seems so close around us. In 2024, with hearts broken by the atrocities of October 7th in Israel, stunned and agonized about the continued loss of life in Palestine, and concerns about the threat of a new global conflict growing, I know that many times in these last weeks, I have again turned to the spirit of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and particularly to his words from that particular speech, A Time to Break Silence. It sounds with a particular resonance. Reading it, I realized that this agony of being a moral voice, of holding our leaders in the faithful embrace of what they can be, has ever been a struggle. The struggle today is no different from the struggle of Vietnam or the struggle of those veterans of the Second World War for whom they almost had to march on Washington that first time. Truth is not always convenient, and the times that we are called to witness cannot be put on our time clock schedule, as Grace Lee Boggs reminded us. Tomorrow, as we bear witness to the legacy of Dr. King, it is important to continue to call for the end of racial inequity and the recognition of the value of all the lives of all races, and particularly that Black Lives Matter, for that is still a struggle in so many places in our world. It is also important to remember the work that he was doing on the trip on which he ended his life, the work of economic justice. For the great divide between the haves and the have-nots in this nation is only growing still. And in 2024, let us not forget that Dr. King was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. He felt that as such, he had a particular commission to be the steward of the cause of peace. These are his words. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they say. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. Some years back, the ethicist Rushmore Kidder said that the hardest limits in our world are not right-wrong dilemmas, they are right-right dilemmas. In 2024, I believe we are living in a world where we're facing the wrong. The images of those whose lives were senselessly lost on October 7th in Israel continue to haunt us and to bring tears into our hearts. in the country where they sought to be safe after centuries of persecution and the Holocaust. It's heartbreaking. We weep for the hostages still at risk and all the lives. And also wrong and deserving of mourning is the fate of the now more than 22,000 Palestinian lives lost, Muslim and Christian, and of many faiths, now ended in the ever-expanding threats, with international reporters now noting this week that famine is now widespread and that death from famine is now imminent. We weep, we open our hearts to their sufferings as well, to their lack of safety. And it is hard. King knew these heart-twisting complexities. Listen to his words. It is not hard to translate them to our time. He said, "A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle, and it seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty programs. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings, and then came the buildup for Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war, and I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in the rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such." Now, some of us, I know, may not agree with King's anti-war strategy. Others may. Yet not to engage out of our beliefs is to ignore our commission as people of faith. My words will go to the White House tonight. After last week's airstrikes in Yemen, observers agree that these greatly increase the risk of a wider war, even as President Biden has been the one calling for a narrower one. The faces of the more now than 25,000 dead in the last 3 months in Israel and Palestine, that our nation would risk instead accelerating violence not to defend human life, but rather because the Houthis' actions, quote, endanger freedom of navigation in one of the world's most vital waterways. And also that President Biden's official statement also includes as a reason, quote, weeks of delays in product shipping times. Like King, I acknowledge with humility that I do not understand all of the complexities. However, I do feel that as part of a movement, as part of the inheritor of the goal of beloved community, in this case, as someone who voted for this president, I have a duty to let my feelings be heard on this and my growing despair over the life in Gaza to be heard as well. My time for silence has ended. Just as in King's time, we face extreme needs here at home, with an epidemic of people unhoused and of children going to bed hungry, yet our resources and moral authority is going to perpetuate the wrong. That the economic reason, the closing of an economically viable, vital waterway, was the cause for us taking this greater risk rather than the loss of 25,000 Israeli and Palestinian lives is unpalatable to me. King's words, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when the machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. I hope that some of you will join us tomorrow on the corner of Civic and Broadway, or you'll do something else to pay tribute on this MLK weekend. I believe that our tribute should not be about looking back just to pay homage to one who solved the problems, though our gratitude is ceaseless. Instead, perhaps, We honor the movement, those ripples that carry him and which now could carry us in a similar time when we are asked to bear witness and hold our government accountable in the spirit of that greater love that is at the heart of our faith, for which the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his life. Perhaps these are inconvenient causes, and yet we are not to forget the life that he lived. For some of you, I know that on Sunday morning, this is not what you wanted to hear. I understand that, and I did not take this time lightly. But we know what time it is, in Grace Lee Boggs's words, on the clock of the world. So let us leave the doors of our hearts open so that we can hear the beat of the marching of that which is larger than us, which calls us today, and be part of the ever-expanding ripples of movement so that we too can be marching in the light of God, spreading the ripples of racial justice, economic justice, towards a path for peace. I end with the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Let us answer the call. Let us ripple out."
Please rise in body or spirit to sing our last hymn, number 149. And I was told that I have to say, sing with me, sing with me. When I start singing. You're so good. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. A song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Sunny the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had met with the steady beat. Have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed? We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the battered rest, till now we stand at last, where the bright gleam of our bright star
Thank you for joining us in what has been designated as the African American National Anthem by the NAACP in 1920. These are the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We can no longer afford to worship the God of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate, and history is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursue this self-defeating path. We must stand, as Arnold Toynbee says, and believe that love is the ultimate force that makes for the saving choice of life and good against the damning choice of death and evil. Therefore, the first hope in our inventory must be the hope that love is going to have the last word. Let us carry the words of love out into our lives, out into the world, and out into service